Sir, this is a financial institution, not a charity counter where anyone can stroll in with a worn-out sack and expect to be treated like they belong. You look like you picked that bag up from a pawn shop and decided to try your luck among people who actually build wealth. Men like you walk in here with that quiet stare, thinking politeness will cover whatever mess you're dragging behind you. Let me be very clear. Respect in this building is earned, not performed. So before you embarrass yourself any further, explain why you're standing in my lobby with something that looks like trouble waiting to happen. The words sliced cleanly through the marble stillness. Jeremiah Cole, 72, a dark-skinned black man with neatly trimmed silver hair, a plain brown coat, and the composed stillness of someone who had spent decades mastering silence as survival, stood at the counter without flinching. One hand rested on a black cane worn smooth by time. The other remained on the handle of a weathered leather bag. Across from him stood Richard Harlan, 45, white, tall, sharply groomed branch director of Crown Federal Trust's flagship Atlanta office, a man whose confidence had been reinforced by years of unquestioned authority. The teller, a young woman named Marissa, tried to steady her voice. "Sir, he just wants to make a deposit." Richard gave a short laugh, loud enough for nearby clients to hear. "A deposit? With that?" Several heads turned. Jeremiah's tone was calm. "Yes." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Then start acting like someone asking for permission, not someone setting conditions." Marissa hesitated, then unfastened the brass buckles and opened the bag. Her breath caught instantly. Inside were tightly banded stacks of cash, old bills carefully arranged, dense enough to feel heavy even from a distance. "Mr. Harlan," she whispered. Richard stepped closer, stared down into the bag, and straightened slowly. The contempt on his face did not disappear. It sharpened. "How much is in there?" "Enough," Jeremiah said. A ripple of whispers moved across the lobby. Crown Federal Trust was designed to feel untouchable. Polished black floors, gold accents, glass offices that turned authority into architecture. Clients came here expecting discretion, control, reassurance. What they did not expect was a quiet old man with a battered bag becoming the center of attention. Richard's voice cooled. "You don't just walk into my branch dressed like you wandered in off a city bus, drop suspicious cash on my counter, and answer questions like you're doing us a favor." "I came to conduct business," Jeremiah replied. "Then conduct it with humility." The line lingered in the air. An older customer near the coffee station frowned openly. Another woman shifted her chair to watch more closely. Jeremiah reached slowly into his coat and placed a sealed envelope on the marble surface. "What is that?" Richard asked. "Documentation." Richard did not touch it. "If it mattered, you would have presented it first. A deposit should not require a defense." For a moment, even Marissa seemed unsure where to look. But Richard had already decided how this scene would end. He turned slightly toward the entrance. "Security!" A uniformed guard began walking closer, not aggressively yet, but visibly enough to transform curiosity into tension. Across the room, Naomi Price, 26, a light brown-skinned black junior operations associate known for noticing details others overlooked, lifted her eyes from her screen. When the bag had opened, she had glimpsed something on the inside flap, an embossed crest, faded, older than the bank's current logo. Something about it did not sit right. At the counter, Richard lowered his voice into the tone of procedural authority. "Step away from the line. Now, we need to review this properly." Jeremiah closed the bag gently, leaving the envelope where it lay. He moved one measured step aside, not hurried, not resistant, controlled. The guard positioned himself nearby. Customers were no longer pretending not to watch. What had begun as a transaction had turned into containment. Marissa tried again. "Maybe we should take him somewhere private." But everyone understood privacy was not the purpose. Richard folded his arms. "Until we understand what you're trying to pull, you'll stay right here." Jeremiah looked across the gleaming lobby, meeting the eyes that judged him before they knew him. There was no anger in his face, only the quiet endurance of someone who had learned that dignity was sometimes mistaken for weakness. Naomi felt a slow, inexplicable unease. Whoever this man was, she no longer believed he had walked into the wrong building. She was beginning to suspect the building had made the first mistake. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Philippians 4:5. Gentleness, however, was the one quality missing from the room. And before the afternoon was finished, Crown Federal Trust would discover how dangerous arrogance could become when it mistook silence for surrender. If you have ever been judged by your appearance, your age, or the quiet way you carry your dignity, then what happens next with Jeremiah Cole will make you feel the weight of injustice and the power of truth like never before. Don't forget to like and subscribe and stay with Black Resilience Stories to follow what happens when suspicion turns into something far bigger than anyone in that lobby is prepared for. Because Richard Harlan is about to turn this moment into official procedure, and in doing so, he will unknowingly set in motion the unraveling of a secret Crown Federal Trust buried decades ago. Richard Harlan did not insult Jeremiah Cole again immediately. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he shifted into something colder, a tone that sounded reasonable enough to survive scrutiny. His posture straightened, his voice softened just slightly. What had begun as humiliation at the counter was now being converted into procedure, the kind of power that strips dignity quietly while claiming to protect order. Richard picked up the sealed envelope Jeremiah had placed on the marble surface. He turned it once, studying the old handwriting, then set it back down without opening it. "We'll start with the basics," he said. "Source of funds." Jeremiah stood beside the counter, one hand resting on his cane, his expression calm. "They are mine." "That is ownership," Richard replied, "not origin." "It is both." Richard exhaled slowly, as if patience itself were being tested. In this branch, truth requires specificity. Jeremiah glanced at the envelope. "Then you should read what I brought." The refusal to comply with Richard's rhythm unsettled him. He did not want Jeremiah to sound composed. He wanted confusion, apology, visible discomfort. Instead, the old man stood as if humiliation were something he had long ago learned to endure without surrender. Richard ignored the envelope. "Where did you obtain the cash?" "From a reserve." "A reserve of what?" "My own." A faint murmur rippled through the lobby. The building had been designed to feel controlled. Black stone floors reflecting soft gold light, glass offices creating the illusion of transparency, quiet music reinforcing wealth's promise of safety. Yet now, attention was gathering toward the side desk like gravity. Richard stepped closer. "Do you understand how suspicious that sounds?" Jeremiah's voice remained steady. "Only to those looking for suspicion." Marissa, the teller, kept her eyes lowered. One older client near the waiting area folded his newspaper, no longer pretending to ignore the exchange. Richard turned to Marissa. "Flag the transaction. No processing until compliance review." "Yes, sir." He faced Jeremiah again. "Why didn't you arrange a private appointment for a deposit of this size?" "I did not need one." "That amount of money suggests otherwise." "The money is not confused," Jeremiah replied. "Only the reaction to it." The answer drew a small, nervous sound from somewhere in the room, quickly silenced. Richard smoothed the front of his jacket, visibly reclaiming control. "Let me be clear. Men do not walk into this branch carrying large sums of unverified cash unless they are reckless, dishonest, or unaware of the consequences." Jeremiah met his gaze. "You have mistaken your assumptions for facts." The sentence lingered. Across the lobby, Naomi Price, 26, a light brown-skinned junior operations associate known for her careful attention to detail, kept her face neutral while quietly navigating internal archive menus. The faded crest she had glimpsed inside Jeremiah's bag still troubled her. It had not looked decorative. It had looked official. From another era. She searched discontinued institutional identifiers. At first, nothing appeared. Then, Buried beneath legacy branding categories, a partial image loaded onto her screen. Her pulse slowed. The crest was real. Older than the bank's current identity. Older than the executive portraits lining the upper corridors. At the counter, Richard continued. Identification. Jeremiah handed him a wallet card and an old metal key tag. Richard studied them openly. This address, current? Yes. This key tag is obsolete. It remains mine. Ownership and relevance are not interchangeable, Richard said, handing them back. He raised his voice slightly. Do you currently maintain executive, legacy, or private client status with Crown Federal Trust? Jeremiah answered, I maintain what belongs to me. Richard let out a controlled breath. That is not how this works. Then perhaps the system is incomplete. Several customers shifted uncomfortably. The guard near the doors moved a step closer, enough to remind everyone the situation had escalated beyond curiosity. Richard noticed the movement and used it. For everyone's comfort, he announced, we are addressing a suspicious financial matter. Thank you for your patience. The effect was immediate. Conversations died. Distance formed without anyone physically moving far. Jeremiah was now marked, not by evidence, but by declaration. Naomi looked up sharply. Richard had not merely escalated the situation. He had framed it publicly, shaping how the room would interpret everything that followed. Jeremiah's expression did not change, yet Naomi saw something in his eyes, not fear, not surprise, but recognition. As though this pattern of authority cloaking judgment in official language was painfully familiar. Richard folded his hands behind his back. Who assisted you in transporting these funds? No one. Were they reported before arrival? No. Were they transferred from a registered institution? They were brought here to be deposited. That is not the question I asked. It is the answer that matters. For the first time, Richard's smooth cadence faltered. He recovered quickly. You will move to the side desk while we review this matter. Jeremiah rested both hands on his cane. I will stand. That is not optional. Jeremiah looked at him steadily. Authority is not proven by repetition. The quiet response unsettled Richard more than open defiance could have. He turned sharply to Marissa. Contact compliance. If they cannot respond immediately, notify APD. I want full documentation before this situation becomes unmanageable. Marissa hesitated. Sir, he hasn't threatened anyone. Richard's voice hardened. Do it! She reached for the phone. The guard shifted again, positioning himself between Jeremiah and the lobby exit. Containment was now unmistakable. Naomi clicked deeper into the archive file on her screen. Beneath the crest image, a line of faded metadata appeared. Founding Reserve Authorization. Restricted Legacy Access. Her breath caught. Reserve. That was the exact word Jeremiah had used. Her eyes lifted slowly toward him. The worn coat. The steady posture. The leather bag resting beside his leg like something that carried weight beyond money. For the first time, she no longer wondered whether he belonged in the building. She wondered who had decided he didn't. At the side desk, Richard adjusted his cuffs, satisfied that procedure now framed the moment. He believed he had restored order, but Naomi felt something very different beginning to move beneath the surface of the polished bank floor. Something old, buried, and dangerously close to being uncovered. And Richard Harlan, in his determination to humble Jeremiah Cole in public, had just taken the first official step toward forcing Crown Federal Trust to confront it. Richard Harlan did not move Jeremiah to a private office. He moved him into view. The side desk sat in open sight of the waiting area and investment glass rooms. Anyone seated could turn their head and watch. And they did. Jeremiah Cole stood beside the desk, cane planted lightly, leather bag at his side. He did not sit when Richard gestured toward the chair. Sit, Richard ordered. I will stand. That refusal was quiet, but it landed. Richard forced a tight smile. You walk into my branch with a bag full of unverified cash and refuse basic cooperation. You don't get to choose posture. Jeremiah looked at him evenly. Posture is the only thing you haven't taken. A woman near the waiting chairs let out a small breath. A man folded his newspaper and stared openly now. Richard picked up the documents from the envelope and flipped through them without care. Old seals, dead signatures, obsolete structure. This is what you thought would impress us? They are original, Jeremiah replied. They are irrelevant. They are yours. That sentence changed something. Richard didn't respond to it directly. Instead, he widened the humiliation. He turned halfway toward the lobby. For everyone's comfort, he announced, we are handling a suspicious financial matter. There it was. Suspicious. Permission granted. A whisper passed between two clients. With that much cash? He doesn't look like he banks here. Probably laundering. No one asked for proof. Jeremiah heard it all. He did not react. That lack of reaction unsettled the room more than panic would have. Across the lobby, Naomi Price watched from her terminal. On her screen, a legacy archive file remained open. Founding Reserve Authorization, Restricted Legacy Access. The crest matched the one inside Jeremiah's bag. Her eyes moved from the screen to Richard, then back to Jeremiah. Richard was not investigating. He was asserting. Marissa stepped up closer. Compliance is asking whether we should scan the documents. Richard didn't look at her. Not yet. Jeremiah's voice stayed calm. You are delaying what you fear. Richard stepped closer. What I fear is criminal exposure. Then the front doors opened. 2 Atlanta police officers entered. The lobby shifted instantly. Whispers stopped. Spines straightened. Richard walked toward the officers before they reached the desk. Large unverified cash deposit, he said. Irregular documents. Evasive answers. Officer Patel, older and steady, nodded once and turned toward Jeremiah. Sir, is that your bag? It is. And the money belongs to you? Yes. How much money? Enough. Officer Reeves frowned. Richard gave the smallest exhale, as if to suggest this was exactly the problem. Patel kept his tone neutral. Sir, we just need clarity. Jeremiah inclined his head. Then, ask clearly. Richard stepped in again. You see what we've been dealing with? Patel lifted a hand without looking at him. I'll speak to him. It was subtle. But for the first time, Richard was not the central authority in the space. Then a young teller near the back counter muttered with a nervous grin, Guy walks in with a bag like that and expects applause. A couple of customers laughed. Jeremiah turned slightly toward the sound, then back to the officers. He did not defend himself. He did not respond. He endured it. Naomi felt something break in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. This was not confusion. This was public degradation. Officer Patel glanced at the papers. Have these been reviewed? Richard answered quickly. They appear outdated. That wasn't my question. Marissa swallowed. Not fully. That shifted the air. Officer Reeves stepped closer to Jeremiah. Sir, are you willing to remain while the bank reviews this? Before Jeremiah could answer, Richard said, He needs to stay. Right here. Patel turned his head slowly. I asked him. Richard's jaw tightened. Jeremiah rested both hands on the top of his cane. I have no intention of leaving my own business unfinished. The phrase landed hard. My own business. Richard heard it. So did Naomi. So did Patel. Richard moved fast, trying to regain control. This entire scene, he said sharply, could have been avoided if you had been honest, instead of walking in here with a bag full of cash and expecting us to indulge whatever this is. Jeremiah turned fully toward him. His voice did not rise. I have been honest. Then he lifted his eyes, not to Richard, not to the officers, but upward toward the executive floor overlooking the lobby. When he spoke again, the tone changed. It was no longer defense. It was instruction. Call your board. The lobby went silent. Not uncertain. Not confused. silent. Richard stared at him. "Excuse me?" Jeremiah did not blink. "Call your board." Officer Reeves stopped shifting. Marissa froze. Naomi stood up from her chair without meaning to, because this did not sound like a bluff. And in that stillness, a verse moved through Naomi's mind like a quiet certainty. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. Jeremiah had been still through accusation, still through laughter, still through humiliation. Now it was Richard who looked unsteady, because only one kind of man asks for the board in the middle of his own public detention. And that kind of man is not guessing. Silence lingered in the lobby long after Jeremiah Cole said it. "Oh, call your board." Richard Harlan did not move at first. He stared at Jeremiah as if waiting for the old man to flinch, to soften, to laugh, and turn the command into something ridiculous. Jeremiah did neither. Officer Patel glanced between them. "Sir," he said carefully, "are you affiliated with this institution beyond a standard client relationship?" Jeremiah's eyes never left Richard. "Yes." Richard gave a short, dismissive breath. "That is not reflected in any current record." "That," Jeremiah replied, "is precisely the problem." The line landed like a quiet accusation. Around them, the lobby remained frozen in watchful tension. Customers who had moments ago whispered now listened in uncomfortable stillness. The humiliation had paused. Something else had taken its place. Richard straightened his jacket. "Mr. Cole, you do not get to demand executive attention because you are unhappy with a transaction review." "I am not unhappy," Jeremiah said evenly. "I am reminding you." "Reminding me of what?" "Your own history." That unsettled more than Richard wanted to show. Behind the counter, Marissa stared at the old documents on the desk as if seeing them differently for the first time. Across the room, Naomi moved from her terminal and approached slowly, holding a printed page she had just pulled from internal archives. "Mr. Harlan," she said, voice controlled but tight, "there is a restricted legacy classification in the system that references a founding reserve authorization." Richard did not turn fully toward her. "That file is irrelevant." Naomi swallowed. "It includes a seal identical to the one inside Mr. Cole's bag." Now Richard looked at her. The police officers noticed the shift. Officer Reeves asked, "What seal?" Naomi stepped closer and set the printed page on the desk. The faded crest on the paper matched the description. From the old documents in Jeremiah's envelope. Richard's confidence flickered for the first time. "That archive is incomplete," he said quickly. "It predates our current structure." Jeremiah finally shifted his gaze from Richard to the officers. "It predates him," he said calmly. Officer Patel studied the paper. "Sir," he said to Jeremiah, "are you claiming prior executive involvement?" Jeremiah answered with deliberate precision, "I am claiming ownership." The word did not echo loudly. It did not need to. Ownership. Richard's composure fractured visibly. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Jeremiah asked. Richard turned sharply toward Marissa. "Contact the regional office." "They're already aware," she said quietly. "Compliance escalated it when they saw the reserve classification." The tension in the room tightened another notch. Richard's face hardened. "Then this becomes a legal matter." Jeremiah nodded once. "It always was." Officer Patel stepped back slightly, reassessing the situation. "If this is an internal ownership dispute, we are no longer dealing with a criminal issue." Richard snapped. "It is not a dispute. It is a misunderstanding." Jeremiah looked at him steadily. "You mistook me for a risk," he said. "Now you are discovering you misidentified the owner." That sentence changed the geometry of the room. The customers who had whispered earlier now stared at Richard. Naomi watched him carefully. He was no longer managing a suspicious man with a bag of cash. He was standing between the present leadership and something buried beneath it. A phone rang behind the counter. Marissa answered, then went pale. "It's the executive floor," she said. Richard's eyes shifted upward instinctively. "They're coming down." A murmur passed through the lobby, softer this time. uncertain. Officer Reeves glanced at Patel. "So, what exactly are we looking at here?" Patel answered, quietly. "A situation evolving." Jeremiah adjusted his grip on the cane, not nervously, deliberately. Richard leaned toward him, lowering his voice for the first time since the officers arrived. "If this is some kind of stunt," Jeremiah cut him off gently. "You called the police on the wrong man." The words were not angry. They were surgical. The elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed. Heads turned, the doors opened. A senior executive stepped out, gray-haired, tailored suit, face already tight with tension. He walked quickly across the marble floor, scanning the scene. Police officers, customers watching, documents on a public desk. Then his eyes found Jeremiah. He stopped. Not gradually, not subtly, stopped. "Mr. Cole?" The name left his mouth like recognition, not confusion. Richard felt it. The lobby felt it. The executive took 2 more steps forward, disbelief and alarm fighting across his face. "Why was I informed that Mr. Cole was being detained in the lobby?" "Detained." The word cut through the air. Officer Patel stepped back fully now, understanding the shift. Officer Reeves straightened but said nothing. Richard opened his mouth, but the executive did not let him speak. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice strained, "why are you standing out here?" Jeremiah answered calmly, "Because your branch manager chose to perform authority before reviewing history." The executive's eyes dropped to the documents on the desk. He recognized them. That much was clear. He looked at Richard, then at the officers, then back at Jeremiah. The humiliation had reversed direction, not loudly, but undeniably. "Everyone clear the immediate area," the executive said quietly. Customers began stepping back. Chairs scraped lightly across marble. The spectacle dissolved into uneasy retreat. Richard stood frozen. Naomi felt her pulse hammering in her ears, because she understood something Richard had not yet accepted. This was no longer about a deposit. It was about what had been erased, and who had been erased with it. The executive turned to Jeremiah again. "Sir," he said carefully, "perhaps we should move this upstairs." Jeremiah did not move. Not yet. "I asked for the board," he said. The executive nodded slowly. "You'll have them." And for the first time since entering the bank, Jeremiah allowed himself the smallest shift of posture. Not surrender, not triumph. Recognition. If you have ever watched power misjudge the quietest person in the room, then what happens upstairs next will change everything you thought this story was about. Stay with Black Resilience Stories, because the truth waiting on that executive floor is far bigger than a bag of cash. Because when the board reviews the founding reserve documents, they won't just discover who Jeremiah Cole is, they will discover what Crown Federal Trust did to him. The executive elevator doors closed behind them. The lobby noise faded. Upstairs, the executive conference floor felt different from the marble spectacle below. Quieter, insulated, designed for decisions that never touched public air. Jeremiah Cole entered without hesitation. Richard Harlan followed 2 steps behind, face pale but rigid, clinging to posture like armor. Naomi had not been invited, but she remained near the stairwell landing below, heart racing, aware something irreversible was unfolding. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, 3 additional board members were already present, summoned on urgency alone. Laptops open, legal pads ready. The bank's general counsel on speakerphone. The senior executive, Daniel Mercer, placed the envelope and documents on the long, polished table. "Mr. Cole," Mercer said carefully, "you're claiming founding equity authority?" Jeremiah removed his coat slowly and placed it over the back of a chair. He did not sit at the head of the table. He stood. "I am not claiming," he said evenly. "I am presenting." Mercer opened the documents again, this time without mockery. Founding charter pages, early liquidity crisis authorization forms, reserve creation language, signatures of 3 original incorporators. One signature repeated more than the others. Jeremiah Cole. The first layer of tension shifted. Richard seized it immediately. "These appear to reference a discontinued emergency reserve structure," he said quickly. "That structure was dissolved during the Meridian consolidation 22 years ago." Jeremiah looked at him calmly. "No," he said. "It was not dissolved. It was restructured. Restructured without my signature." That sentence changed everything. Mercer's eyes lifted. "Your signature was required?" "It was mandatory." The general counsel's voice crackled over speakerphone. "Daniel, I need clarity. Are we discussing a historical advisory role or an equity-bearing position?" Jeremiah answered before Mercer could. "Equity." The room stilled. Mercer leaned back slowly in his chair. "Mr. Cole, if you're asserting equity ownership that survived consolidation, that would mean, Jeremiah interrupted gently, that the ownership ledger was altered without lawful authorization." Richard stood abruptly. "That's a serious accusation." Jeremiah met his eyes. "It is a serious fact." Mercer turned toward Richard sharply. "Was the founding reserve fully closed during consolidation?" Richard hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but it was visible. "It was absorbed into operational capital," he said. "Absorbed," Jeremiah repeated softly. "Not closed." Mercer looked back down at the paperwork. He flipped to a page stamped with a red reserve seal. "Why bring the physical reserve funds now?" Mercer asked. Jeremiah's answer was quiet. "Because digital records can be buried." The words felt heavier than the money ever had. Richard attempted recovery. Even if an equity interest existed historically, dilution and restructuring over decades would significantly reduce. Jeremiah reached into the envelope again and withdrew one final page. A notarized amendment, signed, stamped, and countersigned by the bank's original legal officer. The document outlined voting authority protection and anti-dilution provisions. Mercer's face drained of color. "This was never reflected in the post-merger ledger," he said. Jeremiah nodded. "It was not meant to be." The second layer of realization spread through the room. This was not a misunderstanding. This was concealment. The general counsel's voice lowered over the speakerphone. "Daniel, if these anti-dilution provisions were bypassed, then dividend distributions over the past 2 decades would be materially misallocated." Richard's breath hitched. "That's speculative." "It's arithmetic," Jeremiah said calmly. Silence pressed against the glass walls. Mercer closed the folder slowly. "Mr. Cole, why wait this long?" Jeremiah's gaze shifted toward the skyline beyond the boardroom windows. "Because sometimes you wait to see whether an institution remembers who built it." "And today?" "Today," Jeremiah said evenly, "your branch manager decided to treat ownership like trespass." Richard's composure finally fractured. "This is not about me." Jeremiah looked at him. "It began with you." Mercer turned to Richard, voice sharper now. "Why were police called before a full review of founding documentation?" Richard swallowed. "We were dealing with suspicious circumstances." "Suspicion," Jeremiah said quietly, "is not due diligence." The words echoed longer than they should have. Mercer stood from his chair and walked toward the window. His reflection in the glass looked older than it had 15 minutes earlier. "If this is accurate," he said slowly, "then we are not dealing with a customer complaint." "No," Jeremiah said, "you are dealing with exposure." The general counsel spoke again. "Daniel, if Mr. Cole's equity stake was unlawfully suppressed, we are looking at civil liability, shareholder impact, potential regulatory inquiry, possibly criminal review depending on who authorized the ledger revision." Richard's voice rose. "That's extreme." Jeremiah turned toward him. "Is it?" Richard had no answer. Mercer faced Jeremiah once more. "You understand," he said. "This will trigger forensic audit, emergency board vote, and potential leadership suspension." Jeremiah nodded once. "I asked for the board." Mercer exhaled slowly. "You'll have them." He turned to the speakerphone. "Initiate full historical audit. Pull original consolidation files. Freeze any discretionary equity adjustments until review." The command carried weight. For the first time that afternoon, it was not Jeremiah being examined. It was the bank. Richard stood motionless beside the table, watching control slip from his hands in silent increments. Jeremiah placed both hands lightly on the polished boardroom surface. For a brief moment, no one spoke. And into that silence, like a reminder older than corporate law, came a quiet truth. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. Luke 8:17. Mercer closed the folder. "We should never have let this reach the lobby," he said quietly. Jeremiah's response was simple. "You should never have let it reach 22 years. The air felt thinner now. The humiliation downstairs had been loud. This reckoning was silent and far more dangerous. The boardroom no longer felt insulated. It felt unstable. Daniel Mercer stood at the head of the table reviewing preliminary summaries from the legal team. The general counsel had shifted from cautious language to risk assessment language, the kind that changed stock prices and executive careers. Jeremiah remained standing. Richard Harlan, however, had begun to recover. Shock had faded. Instinct had returned. He straightened his jacket and leaned forward slightly. "Daniel," he said carefully, "we need to approach this rationally. Even if a historical equity interest existed, statute of limitations applies. Corporate restructurings have legal protections. Dividend reallocations were approved by majority vote at the time." Mercer did not look up. Jeremiah did. "Approved," Jeremiah said quietly. "By whom?" Richard did not hesitate. "By the acting board." "Acting," Jeremiah repeated. The word hung. Richard continued, regaining confidence. "Mr. Cole's absence from the voting record during consolidation is documented. There is no evidence he contested at the time." Jeremiah's gaze sharpened slightly. "There is evidence," he said. "You just haven't looked in the correct place." Mercer finally lifted his eyes. "What place?" Jeremiah withdrew a small secondary envelope from his coat pocket, thinner, less formal than the first. "This," he said calmly, placing it on the table, "was never entered into your digital system." Mercer opened it carefully. Inside, certified mail receipts, a copy of a formal objection letter dated during the consolidation period, and a signature acknowledgement from the bank's former legal officer. The room shifted again. Richard's voice hardened. "That could have been filed improperly," Jeremiah answered without raising his tone. "It was filed correctly." The general counsel's voice returned over speakerphone, sharper now. "Daniel, if written objection existed and was acknowledged, then any vote taken without resolving that objection may be procedurally void." Mercer closed his eyes briefly. Richard moved quickly. "That assumes authenticity." Jeremiah met his stare. "You know it is." Richard's mask cracked, only slightly, but enough. He changed tactics. "If this escalates publicly," he said, turning toward Mercer, "we are not discussing one man's equity claim. We are discussing reputational collapse, shareholder panic, regulatory scrutiny, federal audit." The word federal landed heavier than the others. It was a warning, a threat. Mercer understood it immediately. Jeremiah did too. For a brief moment, silence settled, and something subtle happened. Mercer hesitated. And in that hesitation, Richard saw opportunity. "We can resolve this quietly," Richard pressed. "Private arbitration, confidential settlement, avoid unnecessary exposure." There it was, the false victory moment. Contain it. Pay it. Silence it. Jeremiah watched carefully. Mercer folded his hands. "Mr. Cole, would you consider private resolution?" The question was measured, professional, but it carried implication. Jeremiah's eyes moved from Mercer to Richard and back again. "Private resolution," he repeated softly. "Yes," Mercer said, "without triggering audit protocols." Richard's breathing steadied. This was the path. This was control. Jeremiah considered the skyline beyond the glass wall. Then he spoke. "No." The word did not echo. It did not need to. Richard's jaw tightened. Mercer leaned forward. "May I ask why?" Jeremiah's voice remained level. "Because this stopped being private when your branch manager called the police." The reminder landed hard. Richard attempted one final maneuver. "If the objection letter existed," he said carefully, "why wait 22 years? Jeremiah turned toward him fully now. "I did not wait." Richard blinked. Jeremiah continued. "I was locked out." The words chilled the room. "Locked out?" Mercer repeated. "My executive credentials were revoked within days of the consolidation vote. My access to digital records terminated. My communications redirected. My voting authority classified as inactive." Richard's face drained of color. "That is not possible," he said. "It was executed," Jeremiah replied. Mercer's eyes shifted slowly toward Richard. "Was it?" Richard hesitated. That hesitation lasted longer this time, and everyone saw it. The general counsel's voice returned, no longer cautious. "Daniel, if an executive credential was deliberately revoked to suppress voting authority, we are no longer in civil territory." No one spoke. The implication was clear. This was not bookkeeping. This was obstruction. Richard stepped back from the table. "This is conjecture." Jeremiah reached into his coat once more and placed a small plastic access card onto the table. Expired. Deactivated. Stamped with his name and title from 2 decades earlier. "Deactivated 48 hours after my formal objection," he said quietly. Mercer stared at the card. The timeline aligned. Too precisely. The false victory collapsed. Richard's attempt to contain the damage had instead exposed something worse. The room felt smaller now. Mercer straightened slowly. "I need full credential revocation logs from the consolidation period," he said. Richard's voice rose slightly. "Daniel, this is unnecessary escalation." "No," Mercer said firmly. "This," Jeremiah said calmly, "is accountability." The general counsel spoke again, voice steady and heavy. "Daniel, we must notify external regulatory counsel immediately. If suppression of ownership rights occurred intentionally, we are facing potential criminal inquiry." Criminal. The word that had been thrown at Jeremiah in the lobby now circled back toward the executive table. Richard stood frozen. The weight of it had shifted. Jeremiah did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply watched the system begin to examine itself. Mercer turned toward him. "Mr. Cole, if what you are presenting is accurate, this will not remain internal." Jeremiah nodded once. It never should have been. Silence settled again. But this time it was not fragile. It was heavy. And then Mercer's phone vibrated. He looked down at the screen. His expression changed. "What is it?" Richard demanded. Mercer did not answer immediately. He read the message fully. Then he looked up. "Internal audit just flagged something." Richard's breath stalled. "Flagged what?" Mercer spoke slowly. "Archived email traffic from Consolidation Week." Jeremiah's eyes sharpened. Mercer swallowed. "There are references," he said carefully, "to neutralizing dissenting founder position before vote closure." The room went completely still. Richard's hand gripped the back of his chair. "That's misinterpreted." "Is it?" Jeremiah asked quietly. Mercer looked at Richard, and for the first time that afternoon, there was no protection in his gaze, only assessment. Because this was no longer about a disputed reserve fund. It was about intent, and intent changed everything. When the archived emails are opened and the full chain of authorization is exposed, Crown Federal Trust won't just be facing civil liability, They'll be facing names, and one of those names will not belong to Richard alone. The archived emails were projected onto the boardroom screen. No one spoke while they loaded. Jeremiah remained seated now, not at the head of the table, but at equal distance from it. His cane rested across his lap. His posture was unchanged, steady, composed, unhurried. Richard stood near the far wall. He had not asked to sit. He had not been invited to. Daniel Mercer clicked the first email open. The timestamp read, 6 days before consolidation vote. The subject line, RE, Founder Objection, Risk Mitigation Strategy. The room tightened. Mercer read aloud. If Cole's voting authority remains active, consolidation terms cannot be finalized without renegotiation. Legal recommends revocation of access credentials under structural reclassification clause. Silence. Another email. Deactivate founder credentials. Frame as transitional systems adjustment. Vote must proceed without delay. The sender's name appeared on the screen. Former Chief Financial Officer, CC'd. Acting Legal Counsel, and one additional name lower in the chain. Richard Harlan, Operations Director at the time. Richard stepped forward abruptly. That was standard procedure. Mercer turned slowly. Standard? Yes, Richard insisted. During structural consolidation, legacy credentials were temporarily frozen. It was administrative. Jeremiah spoke calmly. My credentials were never restored. The room felt colder. The general counsel's voice came through the speakerphone, steady and unyielding. Daniel, the language here implies intentional suppression of a dissenting equity holder to force vote closure. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. Richard's composure cracked further. You're interpreting internal language without context. Jeremiah turned toward him. Provide the context. Richard had none that didn't condemn him. Mercer opened the next attachment. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen. Dividend allocations from the first 5. Post-consolidation quarters. Jeremiah's name was absent. A separate ledger column labeled Legacy Reserve Absorption showed redistribution across executive incentive accounts. The numbers were not small. They were staggering. Richard's breathing grew shallow. That was authorized by the board, he said. Jeremiah answered without raising his voice. A board operating without lawful voting authority. The weight of it was undeniable now. This was not oversight. It was removal, not error, erasure. Mercer turned away from the screen and faced Richard directly. Were you aware that Mr. Cole's objection had not been resolved prior to the vote? Richard hesitated. It was not a small hesitation. It was the kind that cost careers. I was advised that the matter was administratively neutralized, he said. Neutralized. The word hung in the air like smoke. Jeremiah's gaze hardened slightly. Neutralized, he repeated. Mercer's jaw tightened. You signed operational execution on the credential revocation. I acted under instruction. From whom? Richard looked toward the screen, toward the names that were no longer alive to defend themselves. They're gone, he said quietly. Yes, Jeremiah answered. They are. The room understood what that meant. The men who had engineered the consolidation were retired, deceased, or removed from active leadership. But the benefits had remained. The dividends had flowed. The ledger had been silent. Mercer walked slowly to the window, looking down at the city below. How much exposure are we facing? He asked the general counsel. Civil restitution across 22 years of dividend suppression. Regulatory investigation for governance misconduct. Possible securities violation review. Potential federal inquiry depending on findings. The air felt heavy. Richard's voice dropped. This will destroy the bank. Jeremiah answered softly. No. He paused. Only the parts that should not have survived. Mercer turned back toward him. You understand, he said. This may require immediate suspension of active leadership pending investigation. Richard stared at him. You're not serious. I am. The boardroom door opened quietly. 2 additional board members entered, having reviewed the preliminary audit summaries. Their expressions told the rest of the story. One of them spoke first. We cannot defend this publicly. The second added, "And we cannot hide it privately." Richard's control was gone now. "You're turning this into a spectacle." Jeremiah looked at him steadily. "You did that in the lobby." The truth landed harder than any accusation. Mercer exhaled slowly. "Effective immediately," he said, voice steady. "Richard Harlan is relieved of branch authority pending full internal and external review." The sentence echoed. Richard did not move at first. Then he laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You're sacrificing me to contain this." Mercer's eyes did not soften. "You signed the execution." Richard looked toward Jeremiah. "You waited for this," he said. Jeremiah shook his head gently. "I hoped you would have remembered." That was worse, because it was not revenge. It was disappointment. Security entered quietly, not aggressively, not publicly, but with unmistakable finality. Richard's shoulders sagged for the first time. As he was escorted toward the door, he turned once more. "You think this makes you powerful?" he said to Jeremiah. Jeremiah answered calmly, "It makes the record accurate." The door closed behind Richard. Silence filled the boardroom again. Mercer sat slowly. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we will initiate immediate restitution calculations and formal board recognition of your equity status." Jeremiah nodded. "Do what is lawful," he replied. Mercer studied him. "You could have demanded this." Privately, Jeremiah's voice remained even. "I asked only for review." The general counsel spoke again. "Daniel, regulators will need to be notified voluntarily. Transparency may reduce penalty exposure." Mercer nodded. "We will notify." The board members exchanged glances. 22 years of concealed equity, 22 years of dividend suppression, 22 years of silence, all undone in a single afternoon because one man had refused to disappear quietly. Jeremiah stood slowly. He picked up his cane. Mercer rose with him. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Jeremiah met his eyes. "You owe the institution correction." The boardroom felt smaller than before, not because of Jeremiah, but because truth had taken up space. Mercer extended his hand. Jeremiah took it. Not triumphantly, not warmly, formally. Outside the boardroom glass, staff had begun whispering again, but this time the whispers were different. Not suspicion, recognition. The man escorted out had been the one who called the police. The man walking calmly beside the executive was the one who owned the founding reserve. Power had shifted, not through shouting, through endurance. As Jeremiah approached the elevator, Naomi stood waiting in the hallway. She did not know whether she was permitted to speak. He paused beside her. "You saw it," he said gently. "Yes, sir." "Then remember it." The elevator doors opened. Jeremiah stepped inside. As they closed, Naomi felt a verse surface quietly in her mind. Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. Proverbs 26:27. Downstairs, the lobby had already begun to change. Security cameras were being reviewed, compliance reports rewritten, internal audit notifications dispatched. The cost had begun. Not in headlines, not yet, but in signatures, in suspensions, in sealed investigation files, and the true price of erasure was no longer theoretical, it was documented. 3 weeks later, Crown Federal Trust did something it had not done in 22 years. It corrected the record. The press conference was not grand. No dramatic banners, no polished promotional video, just a long table, microphones, legal representatives, and the full board seated under bright, unforgiving lights. Daniel Mercer spoke first. After a comprehensive forensic audit and independent legal review, Crown Federal Trust acknowledges that founding equity protections were improperly suppressed during the Meridian consolidation. We are issuing a formal executive apology and initiating a binding settlement agreement restoring all suppressed equity, dividend distributions, and voting authority. The words were careful, measured, expensive. Behind him, the corrected founding charter appeared on the screen. Jeremiah Cole's name stood clearly among the original incorporators. No redactions, no omissions, no inactive classification, just his name, restored. Regulatory council had already been notified voluntarily. The board had approved external compliance monitoring for 5 years. Executive compensation structures were frozen pending restructuring. The internal investigation had expanded beyond Richard Harlan, touching former leadership decisions now under review by federal authorities. Brand accountability was no longer a slogan in annual reports. It was survival. Jeremiah stood at the edge of the stage, not seated with the board, not elevated above them. He wore the same simple coat he had worn the day he entered the lobby with a leather bag. When Mercer finished, he stepped aside. Jeremiah approached the podium slowly. He did not bring notes. He did not bring anger. He looked at the room, journalists, staff members, community representatives, and then he spoke. "I did not come here to destroy a bank," he said calmly. "I came here to remind it who built it." Silence settled over the room. The founding reserve was not created for executive bonuses, he continued. It was created to protect depositors during crisis, to ensure trust survived market fear. That principle matters more than any individual dividend. He paused. And it matters more than my pride. The cameras clicked softly. "I accept the settlement agreement," he said. "But I also accept responsibility. Institutions forget when people allow them to. Memory must be guarded." No applause followed. Just respect. Afterward, inside the same lobby where humiliation had once unfolded, a small plaque was installed beside the original marble column near the entrance. It read, "Jeremiah Cole, Founding Reserve Architect, Equity Restored. Governance reaffirmed, no grand ceremony. Just correction." Employees walked past it carefully that afternoon. Some paused. Some read it twice. Naomi stood in front of it longer than anyone. Jeremiah entered quietly near closing time. The lobby was calmer now, the tension gone, the spectacle forgotten by most. Naomi approached him. "Sir," she said softly, "the audit confirmed everything." "I know," he replied. "They're restructuring governance oversight." "They should." She hesitated. "Why didn't you demand more?" Jeremiah looked around the lobby, the counters, the marble, the people moving inside it. "Because power that is demanded loudly is often defended loudly," he said. "Power that is proven quietly reshapes itself." He reached into his coat and withdrew the same leather bag. He handed it to her. "The reserve belongs back in institutional custody," he said. "But this time, it will be recorded properly." Naomi accepted it carefully. As Jeremiah turned to leave, he paused beside the new plaque. For a brief moment, he touched the engraved letters of his name. Not possessively, not triumphantly, gratefully. Outside, the evening sun reflected against the building's glass facade. The same doors he had walked through under suspicion opened for him again. But this time, no one questioned his presence. No one whispered. No one laughed. He stepped onto the sidewalk with steady rhythm, cane tapping lightly against concrete. And in the quiet of that fading light, another verse moved gently through the moment. "Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues with injustice." Proverbs 16:8. The bank still stood, the system still functioned, but it functioned differently now, because one man had refused to disappear quietly, and dignity, though once restored, leaves a permanent imprint. Jeremiah did not look back. He did not need to. His name was no longer erased. This story is not about revenge. It is about correction. Jeremiah Cole represents quiet power, the kind that does not shout in humiliation, does not crumble under insult, and does not trade dignity for immediate retaliation. He embodies Black excellence not through wealth, but through endurance and moral clarity. He stands for memory, principle, and the belief that institutions must answer to the truth that built them. Richard Harlan represents a different force. Procedural arrogance. He is not a cartoon villain. He is a man who believed authority excused assumption. His downfall was not triggered by hatred alone, but by certainty without verification. He mistook posture for superiority and policy for protection. Through this story, we see how easily systems can bury names, how quickly public humiliation can form without evidence, and how dangerous it is when institutions forget who laid their foundation. Justice here was not loud, it was documented, and that is a deeper kind of victory. In our daily lives, we may not own banks, we may not face executive boards, but we all face moments when dignity is tested, when silence feels safer than confrontation, when endurance feels invisible. The Bible reminds us that what is hidden will be revealed, that righteousness may walk slowly, but it does not lose direction. Jeremiah's stillness was not weakness. It was faith in eventual truth. Perhaps the lesson is simple. Never erase someone whose story you do not understand, and never surrender your name for the comfort of others. If this story moved you, if you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or quietly erased, then stay with us here at Black Resilience Stories. Because there are more stories of dignity, endurance, and moral triumph waiting to be told. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who built it.